So when I was a kid of around 10, 11 years old, something like that, my family took a vacation to Chicago. It was only a few hours away from where we lived in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And we went to Chicago. We stayed in a hotel. We got to see all these really cool museums. We went to the Natural History Museum, Science Museums, all that good stuff. We went to the IMAX theater as well, as I recall. Now, IMAX theaters are really interesting, very cool. They're not always like this, but this particular theater was really special in that the screen went all the way from the top of your head in front of you in like a sort of like you were inside of a sphere kind of a thing. So you're kind of surrounded 100% almost, all the way from your peripheral vision in front of you and above you by the screen. So instead of just being in a regular movie theater with a flat screen in front of you, this really created sort of an immersive experience. I'd never been to a theater like this before. It was really cool, especially to see a nature program. So we saw, I don't even know what it was about, but we saw some type of a movie there, and we had this really cool immersive experience. But there was this moment where it wasn't even the movie. There was just maybe it was the production company or something like that had their little, their little graphic or something. And so at the very beginning of the movie, there was this moment where the screen was totally black and you're just starting the movie. And then all of a sudden you see this little speck on the screen, and the speck starts to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And you're watching and you're like, what is this thing coming towards me? And because this is so immersive and because you have so much screen surrounding you, you kind of can't get away from it. It looks like it's going to hit you. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then you notice it's the earth and it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it basically, because the screen is so huge, it feels like it overtook me when I was young like this, watching this movie. I just felt completely overtaken by this image. And to be honest, it scared the crap out of me. And I didn't expect it. And I didn't expect it to be so just overtaking, right? So I have this very powerful memory of this, this huge earth coming towards me. And it created this kind of a silly fear for the rest of my life. I remember at one point I was looking at my science textbook at the planets. We were having a lesson about the planets, and I was looking at the moon, the little picture of a moon, and then I looked at a little picture of, say, Mars or something, and then I looked at a picture of the Earth, and I looked at a picture of, Saturn, Jupiter, and then you see the sun, and the sun can't even fit on the page because it's so large comparatively to, say, the moon, for instance. And I started crying because I was also just overtaken with sort of the vastness of, the universe kind of a thing. And there are these moments that we have in our lives where we can start to really see the interplay between, large and small, and our brain can sort of grasp this vastness. And it doesn't always do this, but when we do, it gets really overwhelming. It's like when you see those little videos. You ever seen a video like that where you see a little speck, like I was talking about with the earth kind of a thing, and you see, and it sort of gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But you go the other direction now. So like, say you see a picture of, maybe the cosmos, you see like maybe the Milky Way, and then it kind of goes in further and you see maybe kind of a little speck, which ends up being the sun. And then it goes in further and you see a little speck, which ends up being the earth. And you keep going in and in, smaller and smaller and smaller in scale. So these kinds of moments that we have where we can sort of visually start to imagine big and small in our worlds is a really powerful thing, right? So powerful that it traumatized me to look at a science textbook a couple years later, right? That's what I want to talk about today, is this kind of interplay between big and small, macro and micro, and how that relates to not only our healthy eating journey, but our consistency with healthy eating in weight loss specifically, and then just having this amazing eat to live food on a regular basis for the rest of our life. How can we use this interplay to create that? Stick around. This is going to be a fun one.
Hi, I'm Cheri Alberts, and this is the Watering Mouth Podcast, and I'm going to teach you to eat to live, lose the weight, and love the process for good.
Episode 7. Hello. So on today's podcast, we are talking about an interesting concept. I'm sure you've heard this before when you hear about macro versus micro on a nutrient level. So I'm going to give you a little bit of explanation about that. If you haven't heard about that before, if you're a beginner on the Eat to Live lifestyle, or if you just like a refresher, we'll go through that first so you can understand that. But I'm going to actually take this in a whole different route that I don't think you've thought of before, because I think that this interplay, like I was talking about earlier, this interplay between macro and micro on a sort of, general level is really important for you to understand when you're getting started, or when you're trying to learn how to be consistent on the Eat to Live or any other healthy eating lifestyle or just weight loss. It's really important to understand that interplay. So let me tell you first about how this works just nutritionally. So if you've read the book Eat to Live or Eat for Life by Dr. Freeman, which is the basis of my channel, my YouTube channel, this podcast, and everything is about this high nutrient, healthy, whole foods, plant-based lifestyle that we're following. If you've read the book, you've heard about this concept before, which is the difference between macronutrients and micronutrients. So the idea being macronutrients are what everyone else always talks about, right? That's what they always talk about in the diet world, in the, exercise world, the bodybuilding world, etc. Everyone always talking about macronutrients, meaning the 4 macronutrients. There's only 4 of them. There's fat, protein, carbohydrates, and also water. Water is a macronutrient as well. We usually just hear about fat, protein, and carbohydrates, and people are talking about, how much protein are you getting? How much fat does that food have? How many calories are in it? That kind of a thing. We call this macronutrients because they're the bigger nutrients. They contain calories. Of course, water doesn't contain calories, even though it is a macronutrient. But these bigger things that we are always talking about, it's sort of what people focus on as if that was the only way, like by focusing on that, that's the only way that you can lose weight. This is what everything is based on. Weight Watchers, right? Like Weight Watchers is based on a point system, which is sort of based on calories too. When we're talking about caloric density, we're talking about any of these other, like Atkins is, very like low carb. We've got just the keto kind of low carb thing. We have all these different diets that are based on the macronutrients. Whereas you have a diet lifestyle like Eat to Live, which is based on the micronutrients in a food. So we know what protein, fat, and carbohydrates are. And we also hear about the micronutrients, but we don't really understand the difference between the two necessarily when we're coming to Eat to Live. So micronutrients being all the things in food that actually don't contain any calories. It's all the good stuff, all these tiny little wonderful things that are inside of our plant foods, our whole plant-based foods. It don't have any calories. So things like antioxidants, right? And there's a lot of different kinds of antioxidants. There's vitamins, there's minerals, there's all these wonderful things that we know are really useful for us and important, but we don't necessarily focus on those. And what Dr. Freeman is saying we should do is do exactly that. It's shifting our thinking from the macronutrients of caring about the protein, fat, and carbohydrate content of our food. And, it's to some extent even the water content, but caring more and shifting that caring towards the micronutrients. So having as many micronutrients in a food per calorie as possible, right? So we talks about that health equation that the greater health that we want to have is because of a greater micronutrient load. That's how we will create better health in our life. Greater micronutrient load per calorie, meaning less calories in a food, more micronutrients, more things like vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, all the, the flavonoids, all this stuff, these big words that nobody really exactly knows what they do, but they know that they're useful. All of the more that we have of those in our foods and the less amount of calories we have, we're going to create better health, meaning we will have lower weight, we will have more nutrition in our foods, we'll have more fiber, we'll have more of this awesome stuff that helps to support our health, and we will get all those benefits from those micronutrients. The idea being that, you can have a certain ratio of macronutrients, which is what most people think about when they try to diet. They think all about the protein, fat, and carbohydrates and the percentages, the ratios, and all that, as if that really mattered. Whereas in the Eat to Live nutritarian diet, we don't care so much about that. We just care about having a low amount of calories, lots of roughage, right? Lots of fiber, and lots of nutrients per calorie, all right? And interestingly, when we're not considering micronutrients, we're just kind of not seeing the forest for the trees. We're not seeing actual nutrition. We're just counting numbers, right? It's like counting calories, or it's like counting Weight Watchers points. We're making a game out of something, which, can be helpful in certain cases, but we're not actually creating any real health benefit. Now, I've actually heard Weight Watchers has changed their point system in the recent years to say that vegetables, for instance, or at least non-starchy vegetables, are 0 points, which is actually kind of cool. That's a cool thing. They kind of catch on a little bit to what we're doing, that these foods are now unlimited, right? You can have unlimited romaine, unlimited all that kind of stuff. This is kind of taking in that, the micronutrient amount in a food into consideration, which is actually very helpful. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to throw all of those point systems out completely, because if we just focus on this idea of more micronutrients, less calories, and we're not even counting the calories. Let me make that clear. We are not counting calories here. We're just, if you kind of rate foods based on these things, having more fiber, more antioxidants, more minerals, more vitamins, and a little bit less calories, that means you're automatically having plant foods. You're automatically having these high nutrient plant foods like kale and collard greens and watercress and arugula, and you're having lots of just greens in general, any kind of greens, romaine, red leaf lettuce, green leaf lettuce, you're having cabbage, you're having all these very micronutrient dense, non-starchy vegetables, because those are the ones that have the least amount of calories. Similarly, you're having, just non-starchy vegetables in general. So mushrooms, onions, eggplants, even, zucchinis, peppers, things like this. So when you have these types of foods as the bulk of your diet, you're automatically getting a ton of fiber. You're getting, just in general, a ton of bulk. When we're getting a lot of bulk for our buck, so to speak, right? We're getting a lot of bulk. We're getting a ton of micronutrients at the same time, but a little amount of calories. That's what naturally creates that weight loss for us, okay? So this equation, this idea of using micronutrients instead of macronutrients, just not even caring about the macronutrients, having the micronutrients be spot on per calorie kind of a thing, having those lower calorie, higher nutrient foods as the bulk of what we eat automatically creates weight loss. So that's kind of how we think of this nutritionally, right? But what I really wanted to talk about today, so that's all like given, okay? And that's all stuff that you can read and Eat to Live if you want to know that. But what really interests me, what I want to talk about, is this interplay between macro and micro. How would you say this? Maybe like intellectually or emotionally or psychologically is kind of what I'm talking about today, okay? So this interplay between the way that we think about this. Now, it's a good example to see that we use macro, meaning this sort of big view of everything, and we use micro nutritionally. But I also want you to start to think about the interplay between macro and micro on how we look at everything in our journey. Like, how is our journey going? How are we doing? What happened yesterday? What could I change about yesterday? What is happening in general? So that's kind of what I want to talk about on this podcast. What this is basically seeing a perspective of what's happening to you. So I'm going to give you an example. Let's say you got invited to go out with some friends for some drinks or some appetizers, something like that, okay? Now, let's say you also had a stressful week at work and you were feeling very tired and you were feeling you wanted a break, you wanted to celebrate, you wanted to kind of de-stress. And so you decide to go out with your friends. And, maybe the whole time you're kind of wrestling with yourself about what you should order, how much of this you should you have another drink or not, that kind of a thing. You end up eating maybe a bunch of appetizers and you come home, you're kind of bloated with salt. The next morning you wake up, you've got a lot of like salt going on there. You don't feel so good. You're kind of upset with yourself for the decision that you made. You wish you made a different decision, perhaps, right? Like, does this sound familiar to any of you? I know it sounds familiar from my past for sure. So how does the macro and micro come into play here? Well, this is actually where it is the most important for us to figure out and start to use in our lives, seeing the difference between the macro and micro here. Because my guess is that many of you who are new to my work, new to the life coaching stuff that I do, This interplay between macro and micro, maybe you haven't even considered before. So that's why this, I think, is going to be a really fun podcast. Okay, now consider this. That person who was deciding whether or not to go out for appetizers, that person who was deciding whether or not to get the appetizer, that person who was deciding whether or not to have another drink, and then that person who came home, went to sleep, woke up the next morning not feeling so good about themselves, having some thoughts about themselves, right? Maybe regretting a little bit, feeling guilty, maybe upset with yourself. That person who made those decisions is not you. What? All right, hold on, hear me out. And then I'm going to explain how this relates to macro and micro in a second. That person who did those things, who actually decided to do those things, is not you. You are actually the person who thinks about what you're doing. Do you get the difference there? Let me try to explain that a little bit more. You are not the person who made the decisions. You're not the person who just ordered the drinks and the appetizers and things like that. You are the person who can think about that. Now, this is where the macro and the micro comes in, because I want you to start thinking about micro, the smaller, littler perspective of having been the person who got the drinks, right? The one who was inside your head, making the decisions, doing what you do, just, having fun with friends, talking, what it was, maybe flirting, ordering the appetizers, having the drinks. That was the part of you who made the decisions. But there is another part of you who thinks about the decisions you made. Do you see that? Do you buy that? Can you understand that? That's crazy, first of all, when you start to think of it in this way. But what this means is that you are actually not your decisions. The person that you are is the one who can think about what you're thinking about. Okay? You are the person who is able to decide afterwards whether or not that was a good idea, what you want to do about it. You are the person. So let me give you this little idea that could have happened while you were at the bar. So let's say, it's kind of like this idea when people say, I don't even know how it happened. I just ended up having, before you knew it, I had already eaten a bunch of the appetizer, already had a drink or two. And then I was like, oh man, I should stop, right? That person who says, oh man, I should stop, or that person who realizes what's happening, that is you. That is who you actually are. You are not the person eating the food. You are actually the person who can think about what's happening. So I want you to have like a little visual here of you at the bar, sitting with your friends. And now I want you to imagine, you see those things in the movies when someone has a near-death experience and they sort of float above their body and they see themselves doing things. That's you, okay? It's the person who can become aware of all the things that are happening, including what you yourself are actually doing in that moment. You are the one who can see all that. You're the one who can think about what you're thinking about, going like, what should I be thinking right now? Like, what should I actually decide? What should I do in this situation? That's who you actually are. You're not the one that's like just, kind of like going unconscious and deciding to eat the things or whatever. Like that's your sort of lower consciousness, right? But you are actually, so when we think about the difference in the parts of our brain here, there's a part of our brain that is what we maybe call you might have heard it before when people refer to it as sort of the lizard brain or whatever, but you can kind of think of it as like the primal brain. It's in the back, kind of on the inside. It's the sort of the part of the brain that we've had the longest, that has sort of been around the longest. It's the one that tries to keep us out of trouble, is what its job is actually supposed to do. Keep us alive, keep us from certain sudden death and issues, right? But then we have this other part of our brain, the top part of our brain that kind of covers everything. It's called the prefrontal cortex, or it's the neocortex. It's the part of our brain that can do rational decision making. Now, imagine you have these two different parts of your brain and you're getting signals from both, and you can utilize both for different things. one of them you can't control, right? Like you can't so much control the primal brain and the thoughts that it's going to serve you. Like, oh, you should totally have the appetizer, right? You should totally have another drink. That's the primal brain going like, you totally need to enjoy, because we really like when those dopamine and serotonin chemicals come out and make us feel better. And that always makes you feel better. And in the moment, that's the best option for you. You should totally do that. So it screams really, really loud at you because it is the part of our brain that we've had the longest. So it is the most developed and the most able to get you to act, right? Whereas we have this other part of our brain, the neocortex, the prefrontal cortex, which is the decision-making rational side of our brain, which is not as dialed in as our automatic primal brain is. It doesn't automatically make rational decisions. It's not as easy to make those decisions. So it takes some actual work to do that. When these two sides of our brains are warring with each other, the one that's the loudest and the one that we're the most used to letting win, which is typically the primal brain, is going to win out. That is the one that we're going to listen to. So that's why we end up getting the appetizers, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to maintain homeostasis. We're trying to just like keep doing what we always do. That's what the primal side of the brain likes. It just likes for us to be even keeled, doing what we do. We don't want to wreck the boat. We don't want to be losing weight, because that must mean food is scarce. Like, oh my gosh, watch out. Where are the calories? We must eat or we will die, right? The primal brain starts to freak out a little bit when we're actually in diet mode. And so it gets a little bit louder, especially before we've really made solid decisions on what we want to do. But we can take that prefrontal cortex of ours and start to train it towards these rational, better decisions for long term, right? The one thing the primal brain doesn't understand is the craziness that we're up against with the amount of salt, sugar, and oil and massive calorie load that we get from other foods, that are maybe newer, like we've only had maybe the past 50, 70 years. In the food supply, these are not normal foods for us to be eating. These very high, calorically dense foods with lots of salt, oil, and sugar that are created to create profit. They're not created to create health. They're created to create profit from a company, which, in itself, that's just capitalism, right? But for a human, it actually decreases our lifespan, as we know. So we want to figure out how to change that situation. Well, that is by training our prefrontal cortex, that newer part of our brain, to be really good at shutting down the primal brain and going like, nah, let's just chill out. We don't have to do all the appetizers. We don't have to do all the drinks. Let's have less, or maybe we stay in this week, right? Now, that is the difference between macro and micro in this case. So I want you to imagine the micro is you going to the bar and just being there, right? But the macro is as if you were watching a movie of yourself at the bar, right? And you're going like, ooh, I hope she makes the right choice right now. I hope she does. Right? When we get our prefrontal cortex to start making decisions for us rationally, and we choose things that are actually helpful for us, that is when we start becoming sort of macro. And so I want you to think of this out of body experience, like as if you're floating above yourself or watching yourself on a movie screen, and you can see everything's happening, and then you can make rational decisions about it. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought of the difference between these two. If you're into like meditation, or you've done a lot of therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, anything like this is all these kinds of concepts, but maybe you are not very familiar with that. So that's why I wanted to bring this up in our first podcast. What I want you to be doing is just seeing that interplay between micro, the you who just quickly chooses the junk food and eats it without even thinking about it, and the you who can come out of your body and become aware of what's happening and what you're struggling with, and then you can make rational decisions that are good for your long-term health instead of your short-term health, okay? And interestingly, in the way that I was giving you this story in the beginning of when I went to Chicago and I was at the IMAX theater and I got really freaked out by the earth, there is a vastness that is contained in both the micro and the macro. And this is what is so fascinating. There is a vastness of learning potential and activity that you can create in your own life in order to start using these two sides of the coin very efficiently to create the results that you're looking for. And what I mean by this is the micro, for instance, the micronutrients, how to get all these micronutrients, how to learn more about the actual nutrition, get real granular about nutrition, learning this micro stuff so that you can understand it on a much broader level, a much broader macro kind of level, right? We can use that interplay between the two to become a scholar, become, really, really good at Eat to Live, really, really good at healthful eating, whatever version of that is that you want to follow. But then we can use that macro to start to look at just our thoughts and our feelings and how we react to situations and what were we thinking. And so we've talked about this in previous podcasts about the idea of the model that we use, which is that our thoughts create our feelings, okay? And if our thoughts are creating our feelings, and in order to, and our feelings then create our actions, if we want to have different actions, we get to learn then how to change the feelings. And in order to change the feelings, we learn how to change those thoughts. So how do we work on our thought systems in our brains, right? We've got the automatic thoughts, sure, which are not controllable necessarily in the beginning. But then we have this beautiful tool of the prefrontal cortex. We've got this amazing brain who has the capability and the potential to rein in that automatic side of our brain. Like, for example, in the example of going out to the restaurant with the friends, we have the capability of reining in that really loud voice that's like, oh, you need a break, you need rest, you need all that. We can question that. We can start to look at those stories and look at those thought patterns and those beliefs and start to question them and learning which ones are actually very limiting beliefs that we currently hold. And how could we shift those thoughts? How could we shift out of that? That is all the macro work. That's all the macro kind of psychological looking at everything from the top down of what's actually going on here. Instead of just being stuck in our little micro pod of, oh, I'm just going to have the drinks because I don't care. I just really need a break right now, right? That's saying I don't want to do the work, right? I don't want to put any effort in, and that's okay. Sometimes that's just what we do. But when we can start to practice coming up on a macro level, going, what's really going on? What could I change about these situations? What could I change about what I do and my constant patterns? Because the fun part is that when our rational side of our brain starts to get really good at this process of, becoming aware, coming out of ourselves and seeing what's really going on for what's happening, when our brain gets really good at that, that's when our automatic brain stops to signal as much. Actually, technically what it does is it weakens those synapses, it weakens those signals in the brain. So you might have these automatic signals that were very loud, but once you start to get into different habits and patterns, it automatically reduces the loud voice of that automatic brain and helps you to create new patterns. That's how we create new habits. It's how we create new patterns in the brain of learning a language or practicing piano or getting good at something new. We do that because we repeat and, that repetition, and we create repetition by changing what we do and changing what we think about what we're doing. Okay. So this is an introduction to sort of the thought work that we're going to be talking about a lot more here, and how this interplay between macro and micro, we're going to be talking about this so much. This awareness of just what's happening around you is everything. It is everything to creating the consistency that you're looking for with healthy eating. Because consistency looks crazy when you're not very good at it, because when you start on this journey, just imagine it, like most of your activity comes from that primal brain. And so it looks crazy because it's like, oh, I messed up again, and I ate this again, and I did really poorly, and I'm not very good at this, and whatever. You're not supposed to be a perfect tennis player when you first start playing, right? You're not supposed to be a perfect pianist when you first start tickling the ivories, right? Like, you're not supposed to be good when you start. So it's going to look messy in the beginning. But as we practice and as we get better, the more we try and the more we work on harnessing this part of our brain that allows us to be more aware of what's happening, that is when we start to create true change and true habit building that is going to take us for the rest of our lives, creating consistency in not only our healthy eating, but certainly in our weight loss. If we want to lose weight and we want to keep it off, it's all the same concept. Coming out of ourselves, becoming aware, seeing what's happening, and just practicing and practicing and practicing that interplay between macro and micro, and utilizing our brain for the amazing, powerful, beautiful strength that all of our brains have. That's the last point that I want to make. Every single one of our brains, if you are listening to this podcast, has the potential to harness this power and this energy. It has the potential. This is a feature, right? This is a feature like your cell phone has call waiting. Your brain has the ability, the potential to harness this. You have the ability to harness this and create any kind of change that you're looking for. And this is the basis that we're going to be kind of working from. So I wanted to give you this thing to think about, just this idea to think about, that you can think about your own thinking and you can create the change that you're looking for. So stick with me. I'm going to give you lots more information about this as we go. Thank you so much for being here today. I'll talk to you next time. Are you following me on social media yet? Make sure you do so you never miss a beat. Search for The Watering Mouth on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and join my free and totally private Facebook group. Just search for Eat to Live High Nutrient Lifestyle. We can't wait to see you there. And hey, guess what? There's another free 5-day Eat to Live challenge coming up really soon. Recipes, meal plans, grocery lists, and a ton of other people doing it at the same time as you. And don't miss the free included Staying on Track workshop included with the 5-day challenges. Sign up for more information at thewateringmouth.com/challenge. Oh, and did I mention it's all free?